Congressman Scott Perry from the 10th Congressional District as we start today under the cloud of domestic terrorism and these young 21-year-old type white guys who seem to be committing way too many of these kinds of shootings. We had 29 people killed over the weekend in 2 shootings, 20 in a Walmart in El Paso, 9 more in a nightclub spot in Dayton, Ohio. Could have been a lot worse if the guy had got through the door. He did not. They shot him. 56 people, I think I'm correct on that, 56 or 52 people who have been injured, and there may even be a few more than that. With this morning, Congressman Scott Perry. Congressman, two stories that we hear all too much right now every week in America. What is going on?
Yeah. Well, tragedy, and I think we keep missing the mark. Our hearts are broken, and have broken way too often about this. I hear the rhetoric too, and I think that is ascribed to this, and we try and find who to blame, as opposed to trying to figure out what's going on and why this is happening. And Gary, I'm sure you hear it too. Immediately, the press seems to, go to the social media feed and then try and ascribe blame to this leader or that leader. And I don't really think that's appropriate. I mean, we can find examples on both sides of the aisle, if you want to say that about this, where somebody that went and did something like this, murdered people and so on and so forth, found their political leanings with one side or the other. I mean, it's on both sides.
Well, I'll tell you what, I find it, I'll go even a step further and say it's obscene to talk like that. Because I listened to the Beto O'Rourke's and people over the weekend. I understand the frustration, but there ought not be political game being made out of something that's really a problem in the country right now. And this idea of blaming President Trump, and the one thing that Beto O'Rourke did on that I found to be really obscene was saying, well, he's called the murderers and thugs. Well, he goes back to that statement in the very beginning when he said some of the people coming to this country are murderers and thugs, like MS-13 and things like that. Yeah. But, the president did come out and say that kind of stuff the last couple of days, and he was not pointing to all people coming in from the southern border when he said that. So this idea of immediately trying to make political hay out of this, to me, you ought to just be banished from the race at that particular point, but that won't happen, and I'm not expecting anything like that. Yeah.
It's frustrating. It's one-sided. Is in the Washington Times regarding the individual in Ohio. I'm not going to say his name, but the Washington Times reports that this gunman, he's a murderer, to me described himself as a pro-Satan leftist who supported Elizabeth Warren. Is it Elizabeth Warren's fault that this guy did it? Of course it is, and it's ridiculous. And let's remember too, Gary. I mean, this is where we got to figure this out. Years ago, and not too many, but enough, we decided that we were not going to deal with the folks in our state hospitals in the way that we had in the past, because that was unacceptable. And instead of finding another way to deal with them appropriately, essentially, I think we just turned them out on the street across the country, right? These people, some of them might belong in jail, but a lot of them don't belong in jail, but that doesn't mean they don't need help. And we haven't solved that. As a matter of fact, we turned them out on the street, and they went to one place or another, whether it's they're out on the street in Baltimore or out on the street in Los Angeles or in Harrisburg, New York, for that matter. And there they are. We haven't solved that problem, but yet we're willing to say that this is this political leader's issue, or this is that political leader's fault. It's ridiculous, and it doesn't get us any closer to solving the problem. I know for my part, look, we are desperate to find some solution to this, and at the same time honor our commitments to our Constitution and everybody's freedoms, and that's the fine line that we're presented with. But so what can you do?
Let me ask you this question. So I'm seeing like a lot of things this morning: ban weapons of war. This guy had a weapon. I guess the one guy that was shot down in Dayton had a weapon that could carry 300 rounds or something, like some ridiculous number of rounds. I'm not a gun authority here. You know more about that than I do. Do we need those kind of things? And yet at the same time, I'm reminded that the gun is only as good as the intention behind it. If you're out there using a gun for a deadly purpose, I mean, that's really what the problem is. It's not the gun in and of itself is not going to cause the damage, but it is the intention behind that. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's a reasonable conversation to have, but we have to be reasonable about it and look at the actual numbers as opposed to the propaganda that surrounds these things. And oftentimes that's all that's considered. And if you even try and have a reasonable conversation about it, then you are pilloried for being, in the pocket of this lobby or that lobby. Sure. Again, that doesn't serve any of us. I mean, if you look at London and the incidence of knife attacks and knife murders and so on and so forth, you're right. The intention goes with it. What does the person want to do with some inanimate object, whether it's a firearm or whether it's a knife? If their intention is to do harm, a lot of times they can find a way to do a lot of damage in a very short amount of time. It's the intention that I think we have to get to and why they have it. I know that for our part, first of all, it's going to be National Night Out tomorrow night, and it's an important opportunity to get with local law enforcement and understand what they deal with and to have a relationship with them. We also saw, Gary, it's important to point this out, we also saw people marching in the streets saying, what do we want? Dead cops. When do we want it? We want it now, and things like that. Yeah. When you go to intention, allowing that kind of, not allowing it, because certainly we all have our free speech rights, but glorifying that kind of rhetoric isn't helpful. That's number one. Number two, I know for our office tomorrow, we've been working on this for months. We've got the National Secret Service coming up to do a presentation to most of our school district in the 10th Congressional District from the National Threat Assessment Center. And part of it is understanding targeted violence in K-12 schools so that the people in our schools understand what we're seeing and can identify it early and mitigate those things. I mean, what we got to do is tone down the rhetoric that's political about this, that meets an agenda, and try and find a solution that's realistic, that works for law enforcement, works for citizens, and works for people that support the Constitution. I think that's what we're looking for, but we have a hard time finding it because there are some folks that demagogue the conversation even for the sake of the conversation.
Yeah, we come to the conversation from a particular side instead of coming from the side of saying how do we find solutions as a mass of people in this country.